Good evening, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to this St Mungo Festival 2024. I'm looking round and I'm seeing many familiar faces, so thank you so much for coming out on yet another miserable January night. We've got a fantastic festival lined up for you. Just before I introduce our speaker, I'll go through some of the highlights over the next week and a half. We're going to begin in about 5 minutes with Dr. Gordon Wyllie, who's going to be talking about medieval borough life. Then on Wednesday, we have back again, by popular acclaim, we've got the Strathclyde University Chamber Choir, led by Alan Taverner, and they're going to be giving us an evening of An Island That Yearns for Saints, music in honour of Mungo, Ninian and Bridget. Now that's in St Columkille's Church in Ralston. There's no booking required for that. Trust me, it's a beautiful evening. The music is fantastic. It's only about an hour. They're going to be presenting this programme, which will include chant from the office of St Mungo, taken from a medieval breviary, also a performance of Ninian's Gift, a collaboration by the composer Tom Cunningham and the writer Alexander McCall Smith. So that's Wednesday at 7, St Columkille's Church in Rutherglen. On Thursday, we have our second lecture, which will also be held here, and I should have said at the very beginning, we're so grateful to the Archdiocese because, as you may be aware, the St Mungo Museum is closed for emergency repairs, and we had to very quickly relocate, and the Archdiocese very kindly offered us this hall. Had it been Tuesday and Wednesday, we couldn't have been here, so just lucky. So Thursday, we're back here again, same time, we start at 6, we'll end up roughly 20 past, 7:30. So on Thursday we have a lecture by Professor Elaine Moohan from the Open University, From Choir to Congregation, Music at Glasgow Cathedral to 1620. And she'll be looking at some of the music that was used in the liturgies in Glasgow Cathedral through the years up until roughly 1620. And unfortunately, she said there's an opportunity to sing some of the music. So only the brave might want to come to that one. Then, of course, we've got the Vespers for the Feast of St Mungo, which will be held next door in St Andrew's Cathedral on Friday at 7 o'clock. And that's also always a very popular event. And, of course, on Saturday, we have a number of things. Again, we're back to the Mitchell Library for the opening of the Vita Kentigerney, which is it's a copy of a 12th century book commissioned by Bishop Jocelyn of Glasgow. And that's usually a very interesting affair, and there'll be music at that as well. And that will be held in the Mitchell Library at 12:15 Saturday. All going well, we should have the Signs and Symbols of Civic Authority in Glasgow Cathedral. That's an online event at 2 o'clock on Saturday. Now, Gordon and Mark Johnston, who is the minister in Glasgow Cathedral, this will be the fourth event where they have talked about some of the signs and symbols you would see in Glasgow Cathedral. These have become very popular, an online event because people from Australia, Canada and America can watch it as well, and of course everything goes on the YouTube channel anyway. So that I think would be very interesting. And then we finish up with our festival ecumenical service, which will be in the medieval Glasgow Cathedral on Sunday at 4 o'clock. This is always a really beautiful affair. Music provided by various choirs, readings by different representatives of the Christian churches in Glasgow. The only thing I would say is wrap up warmly, because it is cold. One other wee thing that I've missed out is, of course, every year we have Following the Mellon Dinner, which is a short walk on Saturday at 10 a.m. And it's the route St Mungo would have taken following the Mellon Dinner burn from Provan Mill to Glasgow Cathedral. Now, we've had to change the arrangements. It will be someone else taking that because Catherine unfortunately has broken her ankle, I think. But somebody will be taking that on Saturday from the Mellon Dinner Community Centre. So it's a packed week and a half. We hope you can come to as much as possible. But to begin with, we have our opening lecture. We're very lucky this evening to have Gordon Wyllie. And he's got all these initials after his name. I'm not sure what they all mean. I know what WS means. It means writer to the signet. He's a former partner in legal firms Burgh, Semple and Biggert Bailey. He was born in Newton Mearns, but somehow or other he was educated at Dunoon Grammar, which is quite a commute, Gordon, I have to say, every day. Also Glasgow University. He has a long history of public service, both as a lawyer and as a volunteer in various trusts. He's one of the founding members of our Medieval Glasgow Trust, and he is now our secretary. Gives me great pleasure to introduce him this evening. Slight change of plan tonight, for those of you who are frequent flyers. We're going to hear Gordon, we're going to have some questions, we're going to have a vote of thanks from Andrew, and then we've got a real treat for you. Neil's going to introduce Vincent Mellon, who's going to give us some songs about St Mungo to finish off the evening. Yeah? Perfect. So, I'll now ask Gordon to deliver his lecture. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Stephen, for all these kind words and introducing this year's programme, which, as Stephen said, is going to be very interesting. Particularly, I'm looking forward to Thursday, back here to hear Professor Moon speak about early music in the cathedral. Now, John Donne famously said that no man is an island, and with that comment in mind, I'm going to try to explain my impressions of what medieval Glasgow was like, and how this island of urbanity fitted into the maelstrom of medieval life. And to do that, I'm going to try to portray what St Mungo might have found when he got here, how early medieval society might have developed, what King David I and Bishop Johnston thought to do about that, what the borough looked like, how it was organised, and how the struggle to control the wide authority of the borough council gave Glasgow a constitution which lasted from 1605 till almost 200 years ago. Because these are so interesting and less well known, I propose to say quite a bit about the Legis Quatuor Burgorum, or the laws of the four boroughs, and time constraints will probably squeeze out more than a passing reference, if at all, to the Reformation, other perhaps than to the generosity of Mary Queen of Scots towards the university. Now, except for anomalous sites like the Ness of Brodgar, early Britain seems not on the whole to have established significant towns or centres of population, and what you can see here, provided that it's clear enough, is in fact Traprain law, which I'm about to mention in a minute. It's clear from Roman writers that there were tribal capitals at strategic places across the country, in locations like Loudon Hill and Dumbarton Rock for the Damnonii, and settlements of the Gododin or Votadini on the Castle Rock of Edinburgh and Traprain law. And between about 142 and 165 AD, these settlements lay within the frontiers of the Roman Empire as delineated by the Antonine Wall, as did the site of Glasgow, and the name of this new province was probably Britannia Valentia. Now, we're told in the Vita Kentigernii that St Mungo was directed to bury St Fergus at a place called Cathures in a cemetery consecrated by St Ninian. Among the ideas revived after the late antique and medieval periods is the notion that the appropriate place for graveyards is not a churchyard in the middle of town, but preferably outside along a roadway, and in ancient times it was in fact illegal to bury anyone inside the boundaries of a Roman settlement. Now, although the Roman system of law and order broke down after the Roman legions left Britain, there is evidence in Bede and in St Mungo, not St Mungo, St Patrick, that in various places, some areas of Roman local government seems to have survived. For instance, St Patrick says that his father was a decurion, or town councillor, in the place where he grew up, which might or might not have been Old Kilpatrick. Now, although the Diocese of Glasgow was founded in the 6th century, there were bishops in the area before St Mungo, such as St Kesog, whose date is around about 500 to 520. Evidence regarding Mungo's immediate successors is sparse, but one of them is said to have been called Magduen, which might be a variant of Maxen, and Maxen Vledig was the local name in Old Welsh or Brythonic, which was the native other language besides Latin in Roman times Britain, for Magnus Maximus, a breakaway late 4th century West Roman emperor recalled in poetry through the dream of Maxen Vledig, which is one of the earliest British poems. And while on the topic of Brythonic, it may be important to notice that place names tend not to change, even although populations and government does. And the Mollendiner Burn never seems to have been called anything else, except perhaps Mellingdinar, and like the Welsh word for window and door and bridge, this derives from Latin, and it signifies the mill stream. Now, the medieval Glasgow diocese was absolutely immense. The northern boundary probably stretched from the Stone of the Britons in the shadow of Ben Lomond on the north side of the Clyde to Ancram in the east, and at least as far south into what's now England as the Rear Cross at Penrith. This was probably the extent of the Brythonic kingdom of Cumbria or Strathclyde, whose northern capital at Dumbarton was sacked by Vikings with the help of Pictland in 870 AD. And it may have been at that time that the ecclesiastical centre of Strathclyde moved to Govan, a place of far more importance than Glasgow up until the Glasgow bishopric was refounded in the early 1100s by Prince David of Cumbria before he became King David I. Now, one of our most famous Scottish saints is an Englishwoman brought up in Hungary and married to our King Malcolm III. Malcolm reigned from 1058 till 1093, and under the generally well-regarded influence of his wife, the country began to adopt more modern ways. This process accelerated under his descendants, especially under his youngest son, David, who ruled Cumbria from 1113 to 1124, when he inherited the Scottish throne from his brother Alexander I. The term Davidian Revolution has been coined to summarise the many innovations which David carried out, such as the growth of feudalism through the introduction of baronies and other Anglo-Norman institutions. Feudal principles had been perfectly familiar to Celtic Scotland, but rested on a body of traditional customs like in Homeric Greece, rather than written laws or charters. In the feudal world of Western Europe, these old customs had long been modified. The overlord would give gifts of land to his kinsmen or officers, who were bound to be faithful to him, and from grade to grade, each inferior did homage and received protection from his superior, who was also his judge. And as every schoolboy knows, Macbeth became the Thane of Cawdor and Thane of Fife before he became King of Scots, and the Crown appointed vice-comites, vice-comites, or sub-earls, which is to say shire reeves or sheriffs, who administered the king's justice, and a barony was the basic unit of law as well as of land. The grant of a barony or thanage was conferred through a ceremony called seizin, and involved the original owner of what was being conveyed to the acquirer, handing over some typical or essential symbol of the transferred right or object to the new owner. So that if you were a bishop being installed, for instance, you might get a Bible or a crozier, or you might get both of these. And in 1175, Glasgow got a new bishop in the form of Abbot Jocelyn from Melrose Abbey. Shortly after his consecration, King David seems to have conferred on Bishop Jocelyn what became known as the Barony of Glasgow. One of the baron's rights and duties was to hold a baron court, and it was similarly a right and duty of the freemen or so-called suitors of the barony to attend the court and give the baron obedience and advice. James Cleland, in his Annals of Glasgow, claims that the bishops and archbishops of Glasgow had in time 18 other such baronies, and the caput or principal baronial establishment of a barony was normally a castle, and the first castle is thought to have been timber built on a moat by King David I during the second quarter of the 12th century. King David died in 1153 and was predeceased by his son and succeeded by his young grandson Malcolm IV, who appeared in that previous picture. King Malcolm died without issue in 1165 and was succeeded by his brother, King William I, who was an energetic sort of chap and the first Scottish monarch to adopt the lion rampant as his symbols. Now, Bishop Jocelyn was active in promoting the prosperity of the area, and he started out by getting another charter, this time from King William, making Glasgow a borough of barony, or bishop's borough, around about 1175 to 78, with a market on Thursdays and all the liberties and customs of the king's boroughs. And a further charter allowed him to have a fair during a period in July referred to as the Octave of St Peter and St Paul. In chartered towns, the free citizens were known as Burgesses, and originally the Burgesses each obtained their own individual tofts or Burgess feus as immediate vassals of the superior, who in Glasgow, of course, was the bishop. In each case, the Burgesses were bound to give their personal services, and together they had a common obligation to pay yearly into the treasury certain fixed rents collected by officers called bailies, who were the superior's agents. And our chairman, Catherine here, was, at the height of her political career, a bailey here in Glasgow. And Catherine probably knows that their duties included the administration of justice. And in Edinburgh, to this day, the bailies' gold badges bear the image of justice, holding a sword in one hand and scales in the other. Possibly because secular and religious jurisdictions were so intertwined in those days, in 1179 King William's charter was confirmed by the Pope and the borough taken under papal protection. Among other things, Bishop Jocelyn is well remembered for overseeing the reconstruction of Glasgow Cathedral, which is the one that we have today, which had been destroyed by fire. He set about collecting funds and commissioned a monk, Jocelyn of Furness, to write a biography of St Kentigern in order to generate enthusiasm for Glasgow's patron saint and support for his church. It's one of the great ironies of the modern age. There's the seal of King David, and that's the seal of Bishop Jocelyn. It's one of the great ironies of the modern age that the Christian church, at first so dismissive and even destructive of secular learning, should have been, often quite unwittingly and even unintentionally, a major conduit of ancient learning into medieval times and thence to us. So too, and for a similar reason, we have a great debt to early Islam for translating out of Greek so many of the texts upon which we rely for our knowledge of prior learning, which underlies today's education, medicine, and science. And in medieval times, these were the province of the church. Not only that, but it was considered very namby-pamby for all but the most elevated of male magnates to know how to read, never mind how to write, although King Alfred of Wessex did much to try to reverse these sentiments while not progressing very far into writing for himself. Now, what you see at the moment, provided you can, is a famous, it's a section of a famous mosaic in Ravenna. And left to right, this shows the famous generals Belisarius and Narses, the Emperor Justinian, an unnamed man thought to be the financier Julius Argentarius, and Maximinian, the Bishop of Ravenna. Because the Western Church remained Latinate, its Clergy could still access those texts that had survived or made it into Latin, and among the texts available were various treatises of the Roman law on which canon law or the law of the church was based. The influence of Roman law was vastly increased by the discovery, allegedly in Amalfi in 1136, of the principal late antique source book known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, commissioned for and under the Emperor Justinian, he who in the middle of the 6th century commissioned that wonder of the Middle Ages, the great church of Hagia Sophia. This was doubly important because in countries like Scotland there was very little law written down, and because everything to do with good faith, such as contract matters or marriage, was the province of the courts of the church, judged by episcopal appointees called officials, who were stand-ins for the bishops or ordinaries, so called because they were ordained judges. And when the Court of Session was set up in 1532 with the help of a church grant, its initial chairman was Archbishop Gavin Dunbar of Glasgow, the Lord Chancellor of Scotland, and half the other judges were also prelates. In those days it wasn't necessary to be legally qualified, but the churchmen would all have a grasp of canon law. Another of Bishop Jocelyn's first acts on receiving his borough charter was to commission a fellow monk called Ranulph of Haddington to review and lay out the streets of the pre-existing settlement that had become the focus of his new borough. It's uncertain how much he retained from the past and to what extent, if at all, Glasgow's layout was based upon some sort of Roman predecessor called Cathures and the Roman road to the fort at Bearsden. But one factor in favour of the antiquity of the cathedral site used to be a very large stone cross referred to as the Great Cross of St Mungo, and along with another great cross in the Rotten Row, it was probably taken down by the Reformers in 1575. To the northwest of the cathedral stood the Girth Cross, and the Girth or Garth was the area around a sacred building within which you could seek sanctuary. But the most important of the city's crosses was the Merchant Cross, a visible sign of the right to hold a merchant. The earliest reference to the town council minutes to the market crosses in 1590, when two servant boys were convicted of climbing on the cross and breaking the same and playing upon the head thereof with a pipe. The cathedral was by no means the only church. In the High Middle Ages, these included St Thenius Chapel outside the Old West Port, the chapel to Thomas a Becket, to Our Lady, mentioned as early as 1293, a chapel dedicated to St John the Baptist, and outside the northern gate on the common muir was St Rollock's or St Roch's Chapel. Now, many of you will know that St Roch was the patron saint to be invoked against pestilence, and it was common for obvious reasons to find chapels dedicated to him outside the walls. Glasgow's plague sufferers were usually sent to the muir to recover or not, and the chapel's burying ground was used to bury the victims. Around 1484, a collegiate church, St Mary and St Anne, had been founded by James Henderson, the sub-dean of the cathedral. Neglected after the Reformation, it was rebuilt in 1592 as the city church for the South Parish. First of all known as the Lay Kirk to distinguish it from the High Kirk or the Metropolitan Church or the Cathedral. It later took the name of the Tron Church because the tron or public weighing apparatus was stored in the base of the tower. In due course, Glasgow's castle became a seat of burghal as well as baronial power, because it also seems to have served as a townhouse and tolbooth, for meetings of the borough council were held there, chaired by the praepositus or provost, who was a baronial appointment up until the 17th century. The principal street ran from the castle down to what is now Glasgow Cross, where there came to be a grand municipal tolbooth, and thence to a ford over the River Clyde, where Bishop Ray built the first stone bridge. There was a small harbour at the Broomielaw, where supplies of grain and other goods could be landed from transshipment up the river in small boats and fish exposed for sale. Other streets included the Dry Gate, the ancient Rotten Row, St Thenus, Greater Trongate, leading off the High Street, and all of these contained measured off frontages for the Burgesses, whose main buildings faced the street with yards or gardens behind, entered via pens and closes. Ingram Street, named for one of Glasgow's provosts rather than Bishop Engel, Rammer Ingram, was formerly known as the Back Cow Loan and allowed the Burgesses to drive or lead their cattle to the common grazing ground of Kirkcannons. That's very like the idea that freedom holders of the City of London can drive a flock of sheep over London Bridge. While the churches and other public spaces could be quite grand, most private houses wouldn't have risen above 2 or 3 stories at the most. Many of them would have been extended by galleries, such as can be seen today at Loudon Hall in Ayr, and very few of them would be slated. Most of them would be roofed with thatch, and the combination of thatch and woodwork meant that, like London and Edinburgh and other medieval towns, Glasgow was periodically subject to devastating fires. Now, in the Middle Ages, one similarity between all these settlements, whether they were of great antiquity or not, and whether the townsmen held directly of the king or another feudal lord, like in Glasgow, there were several ranks or classes of people. First of all, there were the free and the unfree. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the unfree were slaves, although in Glasgow's case, it might actually have meant that, because King William quit claimed to the bishop a man called Gilly Mackay, who was said to have been a serf in Glasgow. Generally, it just meant that the unfree hadn't entered with the town and paid a joining fee to be able to trade, either primarily as a seller or primary maker of goods and services, a classification into merchants and craftsmen we'll meet with frequently. The free were the Burgesses, and they enjoyed various privileges and immunities, including exemption from the many oppressive restrictions to which the non-Burgesses had to suffer. A good idea of what life was like can be gained from the novels of Pat McIntosh about Gilbert Cunningham, an imagined quaestor of Archbishop Robert Blackadder towards the end of the 15th century. And the research behind these stories is based in large part upon documentary evidence. For instance, that you could buy gloves made in Paris at Glasgow Fair. And there is the bridge over the river. You can see the later merchant steeple there, and away over to the right is the cathedral. Now what you see is a coin of Mary Queen of Scots and her husband King Henry Darnley. If you wished to become a Burgess, you had to pay a substantial amount by way of entry money or freedom fine, although if your father or father-in-law had been a Burgess, you could enter at the near hand and receive a discount. If you weren't such a relation, you entered at the far hand and had to pay the full price. In exchange for this, you would receive a Burgess ticket or certificate to vouch your standing in the borough. Apart from these entry monies, the borough was financed by local customs dues, the market taxes known as ladles, and the hire of municipal services, such as grazing dues for animals on the town's commons and the use of the common crier. For instance, it cost the same to advertise a boatload of herrings for sale as to seek a child who was missing or had strayed from home, and there were additional charges if the call was made on a Sunday or after sunset. The church was financed primarily by tithes known as teens, which was still exigible after the Reformation and commonly still referred to in transfers of land and property when I was working as a lawyer, and also by a range of customary dues, such as the so-called corpse presents or mortuary dues and the charges of using the commissary courts. Just like the taxes due to the borough or the baron, the right of collection was often auctioned off. This gave the proprietor ready money and saved the trouble of collection, and as in biblical times, the purchasers were known as publicani or publicans, who of course might equally be sinners as well. It seems always to have been open to the boroughs and their superiors to grant burgessship honoris causa, or simply as a favour, and this still happens today. Recipients in recent centuries have included the Duke of Cumberland after the last Jacobite rising, Lord Kitchener, Sir Tommy Lipton, Marie Curie, Lord Macfarlane of Bearsden, and Billy Connolly. Life in those communities which became boroughs was meant to be governed by the Legis Quator Burgorum, made and ordained by King David I in approximately 1135 to 37 and subject to periodic revision. The version we have is contained in a late 15th century manuscript. Each provision is written first in Latin and then in Scots. The first is quite formal and uses regular spellings. Seem to have got this in maybe not quite the order I'd imagined. The man on the left is King David, and the man on the right is grandson Malcolm, and that's the beginning of a chapter, quite a well-known illustration. There we have King James III. I don't think we're not quite onto that. Well, we can keep you at King James for the meantime. As I said, the Latin part of this was quite formal, used regular spellings, and so if you're at all accustomed to Latin, it's fairly easy to read. But the latter is pretty variable, and so is the order in which the entries appear. It's very unsystematic, and I think that reflects the order in which matters came up for discussion and judgment by the court over the years. Now, although both Tain and Prestwick have claims to be Scotland's oldest boroughs, that order probably belongs to Berwick-on-Tweed, which received its first charter from King David I. By 1157, it was the site of a royal mint and Scotland's principal port. It was quickly followed by Roxburgh, Edinburgh, which is marking its 900th anniversary next year, and Stirling in 1130. To help to guide them in their affairs, they were subject to a sort of supreme court known as the Court of the Four Boroughs, and this met once a year to regulate matters of common interest. By 1487, in the reign of King James III, our man in the picture, this arrangement was found to be insufficient to deal with ongoing business. And although it was still called the Convention of Royal Boroughs, all the Scottish boroughs were directed to send representatives. All that is, except Edinburgh, which had two. And this convention survives as the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, also known as COSLA, and although a mere shadow now of its former self, its powers were originally very great. It was the arbiter of all questions of trade and government within any of the boroughs. All disputes between the boroughs were determined there. It could outlaw any borough or burgess that disobeyed it. It settled any questions about the election of magistrates and councils. It could levy fines. It could appoint commissioners to visit the boroughs and make reports to the convention of what was needful. Its decisions had the authority of an Act of Parliament. It could send remonstrations and delegations to foreign powers, and it fixed the staple for foreign trade in the Netherlands, which was usually at Camp Vere. Originally, the Royal Chamberlain presided over this, but in due course its chairman was usually the Alderman or Praepositus of Edinburgh. Now, unless you were admitted as an honorary burgess, you had to own property within the borough. And in terms of Law 49 of the Legis Burgorum, this had to be at least a rood in extent, which is to say a quarter of a Scottish acre, which is just over 1 1/4 the size of an English acre. The people in charge of this measurement were known as liners, appointed by the Praepositus and Council, and in terms of Law 105, they had to appoint 4 wise and careful men, so that no complaint thereon can be made to the King's Chamberlain, who had a general power of supervision of the boroughs. In terms of Law 119, if there's a boundary dispute and both parties were present or represented at the lining, the liner's findings could not be challenged if left undisturbed for a year and a day. Now, this period of a year and a day crops up quite often in medieval law and custom, and in terms of Law 15, if any baron's or knight's thrall lives in a borough unchallenged for a year and a day, he shall be as free as a king's burgess in a royal borough. And by Law 38, if an ativus, in other words, somebody who was bound to the land, ad scriptus ad plebam, a bondsman, had run away, and the master finds him at a borough fair, he couldn't be retrieved while the fair was still on. And this was all to do with the idea of encouraging trade and making it a privilege to live in boroughs. Now, there is a certain historic and indeed poetic irony about the modern car park signs erected by local authorities, because at one time pay and display was very much what they and other town organisations such as the guilds were all about. We've already seen that burgesses originally had to meet a property qualification. The last trace of this that I'm aware of was the provision of the Local Government Scotland Act 1947, whereby every ratepayer was held to be a burgess. But in terms of Regulation 21 of the Statuta Gildae, which reorganised the constitution of Berwick-on-Tweed in 1249, it was provided that any burgess having goods worth £10 shall have a seemly horse. And if you don't have the seemly horse worth at least 40 shillings, worth at least £10, you have to pay 40 shillings or to pay 8 shillings to the guild. Nevertheless, it was recognised that from time to time it was necessary to borrow money, usually on the security of heritable property. And in terms of Law 29, repayment should be sought at one of the head courts of the borough. And if 3 head courts go by and the payment hasn't been made, the property will be sold to satisfy the debt and the balance will be paid to the debtor. And it might be worth noting that in 1180, Bishop Jocelyn forbade his clergy to inquire their benefices with money borrowed from Jews. Now, this was around the time of anti-Semitic riots in England, so perhaps this prohibition related to what appears to be the first notice of Jews in Scotland. Law 70 provides that in royal boroughs the praepositus and bailies shall be elected by the probi homines or trusty men among the burgesses at the first meeting after Michaelmas, and swear fealty to the king and to the borough and to act impartially. But in other boroughs, these and other officers were appointed by the feudal superiors, often from leets or shortlists submitted by parties having an interest. These might include the councils themselves, as well as fraternities and guilds. For instance, on 5th of October 1574, from a leet of 8 persons submitted by the provost, bailies and old council, the Archbishop nominated George Elphinston, Archibald Line and Maester Adam Wallace to be bailies. The following day, the provost and bailies received commissions to act from the council, and having been sworn for faithful administration of office, just as one does today, I believe, they, in conjunction with the old bailies, chose 14 members of council, the liners, officers, a water bailey, a common procurator or town clerk, and 6 keeper of keys. A lot of the text concerns how trade is to be carried on. For instance, if goods for sale reach a borough by sea, they must be unloaded and sold in open market, but there are exceptions for herrings and salt, which can be bought and sold on board. Foreign merchants could buy only from merchant burgesses, and it was decreed that any disputes had to be raised before the space of 3 high tides had elapsed. Many of the laws, nevertheless, extend into areas that we today would consider more properly to belong, for instance, to the field of family or succession law. For instance, if a burgess dies leaving children by several successive wives, the respective children might inherit only the property acquired during the respective marriages. While there is no mention of women becoming burgesses in the legacies, it's nevertheless recognised that some occupations might often be carried on by women. For instance, whatsoever woman wishes to brew ale for selling shall brew ale all year round in line with the customs of the town. And if she doesn't do so, she'll be deprived of her occupation for a year and a day. And she shall make as good ale as the prevailing conditions admit. And if she's convicted of making bad ale and going against the customs of the town, she shall firstly be fined 8 solidi, which is to say shillings, and then secondly be made the town's laughingstock by being ducked in the cucking stool, and thirdly made to send 2 portions of the ale to the poor of the town, and 3 parts to those in the hospitals, which is to say almshouses, and this shall apply as well in the case of mead as of ale. And each of them shall put her ale wand out above her serving window or above her door to be visible for everybody, and she who fails to do so shall pay 4d for each default. A favourite nostrum in times past, and not unheard of today, is the doctrine of the just or fair price. And to give an idea of the prices prevailing at the time and the value of money, Law 64 laid down that the price of an ox or a pig from a flesher would be a halfpenny, same cost as 5 sheep. Now, while not a great researcher of the internet, and as Colin in particular knows I'm a very untechnical person, I think the current price of a deadweight cow or ox will be between £350 and £500. In other words, in money terms, that is to say about 200,000 times the base price. A silver penny in 1135 might have weighed about 20 grams, so a halfpenny, which was incurred by cutting a whole penny in half, would be about half of that. An ounce weighs about 20 grams, and silver is currently fetching over 60 pence a gram, or £20 an ounce, so it shows how much more currency used to be worth in the past. Law 59 says that no alderman, praepositus, bailey or fidelis shall bake bread nor brew ale while in office. And the Leges Burgorum could be very specific about what a burgess might have and do, which suggests that other people couldn't do this. Each burgess may have at home a corn measure and an ale wand, that's to say a measure of length, and also a weight for a stone and a pound, all sealed with the paraseal. Law 20, only a burgess shall weave wool or shear cloth. Law 18, only a king's burgess can have an individual oven. A law of King William provided that all manner of goods to be sold shall be sold at the market cross or boroughs, or at least offered to a merchant burgess without fraud or guile. This allowed the local authorities to supervise what went on and also extract the market dues known as ladles from the goods and produce on sale. Whoever uses false weight or measure shall pay full forfeit. And in terms of Law 64 of the legacies, if anyone wilfully uses false measure, he shall pay a fine of 8 shillings and made amends to the party concerned and castigated by the bailies. If this happens more than 3 times, he shall be in the king's mercy for life and limb and fined £10 to the king. In terms of Law 60, the bakers were to sell both fine and coarse bread, which is to say white and grey, at the measure and price chosen by the good men of the town and not by their own judgment, and it should be displayed in the window of their premises and not hidden away. The following law says that no one operating such an oven shall have more than 4 staff in his bakehouse, which is to say a master baker, 2 assistants and a boy. Each time the oven is used, its owner shall receive a halfpenny, the master a halfpenny, the assistants a penny, and the boy a farthing. And they shall swear loyalty to the king and the good customs of the town. Similar rules existed for millers and brewers and fleshers. The Code of the Four Boroughs was enacted at a time when disputes might commonly still be settled by organised combat, and there are rules regarding who might challenge or fight with whom. This is really more of an actual squall somewhere, but it gives the idea of what might go on. And in terms of continental custom, at least, commoners were not allowed to fight with on these occasions with weapons. They were sewn into special leather suits, and they were greased, though their hands were allowed to be dipped into ashes to get a better grip. And it's certainly recorded in, I think, the records of the town of Tournai that one of these fights took place between two common burgesses of the town, and it apparently took about a year to organise all of this, and the Duke tried to prevent the fight going ahead, but it did go ahead. The loser had his eyes screwed out of his head by the winner and petitioned for mercy, but this wasn't allowed within the franchise given to the town of Tournai, and eventually the town executioner had to come along and finish this poor man off. So this was not something you engaged in lightly. In terms of Law 12, if a non-townsman wishes to challenge a burgess about anything, he shall not engage in judicial combat with him, but he must take him to the borough court. Nor may a burgess engage in such a fight within the borough. The following law provides that if a burgess of the king has a judicial fight against a burgess of an abbot or a prior or an earl or a baron, he may do that, but not the other way around. And in Law 12, if an elderly person be challenged to fight and be too old to do so, he shall not fight, but become purged by the oaths of 12 of his peers. A burgess could only be summoned to the court by a borough sergeant, and if a king's sergeant attempted to do this, he shall not be heard. But every husband may answer in court for his wife. By the 14th century, the Burgess representatives of at least some of the boroughs were members of the Scottish Parliament, and we find them at that date agreeing that the 10th penny of all rent should be paid to King Robert the Bruce towards defraying the costs of the Wars of Independence. Travelling to Parliament, and indeed anywhere, was a risky business. Archbishop Robert Blackadder died on pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1508, while still at sea on the way to the port of Jaffa. In terms of Law 77, if a burgess goes on pilgrimage with the consent of the kirk and his neighbours, his dwelling and household shall be in the king's peace, which was very important because that meant that if anything happened, the aggrieved parties could go to the king for help. In early modern Scotland, there were no political parties as such, but there were lots of interest groups, and it was important, if you lived in a borough, that you were a member of one of these groups. It was imperfect, and appointments were always the final choice of the borough superior, but in the first instance, the burgesses were the electors, and this brought an element of democracy into urban life. 2,000 years ago, after the annual elections, the Roman praetors or chief justices would issue a public declaration called an edict, setting out how the bare bones of statute law and precedent would be interpreted in the ensuing year. In medieval Glasgow, at their first meeting, the town council would do exactly the same thing. And James Cleland, in his Annals of Glasgow, tells us that immediately after the elections were completed, the council at the Michaelmas Head Court reenacted a series of annual statutes, or would now be called bylaws, fixing the prices of bread and ale, prohibiting the laying of middens on the street or green, the emptying of foul material on them, the sale of what was referred to as blown mutton, tallow or fish, otherwise than as provided, fixing the price at which candles could be sold, regulating the sale of hay, corn, straw, malt and beer, prohibiting blasphemy and profane swearing, regulating the sale of mutton, the visitation of markets, the tasting of ale, the payment of customs by outland burgesses, and the suppression of riotous banqueting at weddings and christenings. Along with the political devolution formalised through feudalism, there was a strong emphasis on communal shared responsibility, and the Guildry movement provided a template for self-regulation under burghal supervision. In exchange for undertaking roles in connection with trading standards, education, the care of the poor, and the defence of the town and the realm, the borough councils, with the consent of their superiors, could grant charters of incorporation, conferring not only corporate status, but a monopoly of economic activity along the same lines as in Berwick and Tweed. According to craft tradition in Glasgow, although the actual authenticity of the grant cannot be vouched, the first group of Glasgow craftsmen who may have acquired such a charter, allegedly granted by King Malcolm III in 1057, were the stone and woodworkers who were working on an earlier version of the cathedral. Now, although these and other incorporated trades were certainly in existence before the dates of their surviving acknowledged seals of cause, the first in Glasgow is generally regarded as the incorporation of skinners and glovers, given such a charter by the town council, by and with the advice of the approbation of the borough superior, Archbishop Gavin Barr, in 1516. Typically, an incorporated trade would be governed by a deacon or kirkmeister and master court, consisting of the senior members of the craft, with power to seek out, confiscate, or destroy work or goods that were inadequate. And a driving force behind the desire to incorporate from 1424 onwards was a statute designed to protect the public from unsupervised work. On the 24th of March 1424, the first Parliament of King James I passed the first act by which the different trades within the boroughs of Scotland began to be regulated, and the word of the act may be modernised as follows. Item, it is ordained that in each town of the realm, of each different craft that is used therein, a wise man of that craft shall be chosen by the rest of the craft, and in consultation with the officers of the town. He shall be called deacon or masterman over the rest for the time assigned to him, to test and govern all work that is made by the workmen of his craft, so that the king's lieges won't be defrauded or harmed in time to come, as they have been in the past by untrue craftsmen. It was also enacted at this time that only merchant burgesses should be the electors in royal boroughs, and it was now that Acts of Parliament came to be written in Scots rather than in Latin. Now let's see what we've got here. There is, who is that? Is that King James III? There's King James III. During the minority of King James III, Parliament went further down the rule of oligarchy and established a system that lasted in essentials, apart from the letter of Guildry in 1605 till 1833. It was provided by Act of Parliament that no officer or council should last for longer than a year at a time, that the old council should choose the new, and that the old council, together with the deacons of the crafts, should annually choose all officers pertaining to the town. This was the very type of electoral college in operation in the Trades House of Glasgow for the election of the deacon convener of the trades, the collector of the Trades House, and the clerk to the Trades House until fairly recently. It might still be, but I'm a bit out of touch now. As far as the incorporated trades were concerned, at least in Glasgow, the choice of the council was made from short beats drawn up by the bodies themselves of people whom they would consider acceptable leaders. It's generally reckoned there were over a dozen of these bodies in Glasgow, and 14 of these survived to become the electoral constituencies of the Trades House. By the middle of the 16th century, strong complaints had been made in Parliament against the gross negligence of the provosts and bailies, as well as the insufficiency of the deacons in curbing extortions made by the craftsmen. In 1555, an act was passed in which it was noted that the practice of electing deacons had been right dangerous. And accordingly it is statute and ordained that no deacons be chosen, but that the provost, bailies and town council should choose the most honest men of craft of good conscience, one of every craft to inspect their own craft and to see they do their work properly, and that the same be of sufficient quality and workmanship, and that such persons be called the visitors of their craft. The term visitor was a medieval and Renaissance term for an inspector, as in prison visitors today and the quinquennial visitations of the Church of Scotland. This cancellation and prohibition seems to have been regarded as a step too far, however, because in April 1556, the Regent Mary, on behalf of the Queen, granted a royal proclamation which restores and reports to them to use and have deacons of all crafts, together with all and sundry privileges and faculties and uses granted to them by our most noble progenitors, notwithstanding the said Act of Parliament. Notwithstanding this indulgence, the deacons or chairmen of the Glasgow maltmen have continued to be known as visitors. A factor in this rehabilitation may have been the governmental need for cash, because once again in 1556 a tax referred to as stent was levied on the boroughs. This is really shorthand for an assessment of contributions. Each of these made its own collection arrangements, and in Edinburgh to this day the Convenery of Trade seeks a stent contribution from every incorporation. In Glasgow, stentors were appointed for each of the 14 incorporated trades and for the non-incorporated inhabitants. Part of the social contract with the incorporated crafts was that they should look after their own poor, and to a certain extent have continued to do that to this very day. In England, the Vagabonds Act of 1572 provided that habitual beggars might be whipped, nailed to the stocks by the ear, or even put to death. And in 1579, as is so often the case, the Scottish Parliament followed suit. It was enacted that such persons that came under the penalty of the Act between the ages of 14 and 70 years may have their ears nailed to the tron or another tree, and their ears cutted off and banished the country, and if thereafter they be found again, then they be hanged. Now, although Glasgow may never have had an actual city wall, the foot of the garden walls at the edges of the borough did found a boundary. Each of the main entrances was closed by a barrier or barras, which was closed, watched and warded at night and on Sundays. And in Reformation times, this latter closure was enjoined by the Protestant bailies to prevent people going to see the plays performed in the neighbouring royal borough of Rutherglen. As we've heard already, in royal boroughs, according to the Convention of Royal Boroughs, the councils were only to consist of merchants, which wasn't always followed. And in places like Glasgow, which is a regality from 1450 onwards, enjoyed most, if not all, of the privileges of a royal borough before it actually became one. And the merchants felt underrepresented because they didn't have a corporate body, although they did have an association chaired by a president. The merchants lobbied the convention to take action, and the result was a series of royal arbitrations with King James as the oversman. This started out in Aberdeen and Edinburgh towards the end of the 16th century, and in Glasgow in November 1604, a deed of submission to arbitration to settle the differences was agreed. The award, when it was delivered in February 1605, now known as the Letter of Gildry, provided Glasgow with a constitution which would last until the Great Reform Acts of the 19th century. In terms of the award, the council was to be split between the merchants and the craftsmen, but the provost was always to be a merchant with a casting vote, and there was to be a single overarching guild for both the merchants and craftsmen, headed by a dean or lord dean of guild, and the craftsmen were to have their own leader in the form of the deacon convener of the trades, and both these personages were to be advised and assisted by their own councils, now known as the Merchants' House and the Trades' House. By the enactment and acceptance of the Letter of Gildry, which was written into the records of the Borough of Glasgow, one might say that the medieval period in Glasgow had come to an end and the Renaissance had truly begun. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attendance. I will try to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Gordon, for a very erudite. I did enjoy. Who was the king that was a very energetic chap?
William
Some
first.
of the throwaway lines were excellent.
William.
We've got time for a few questions, comments, observations, mini lectures disguised as questions. Anything you like?
Basically, you see the Gordon around here history of quality control and services, goods, and when you speak earlier when you were talking about the baker, were you talking about as if there was a standard wage across the city for everybody?
Well, there may not have been an actual standard wage, but in medieval times, the idea of people doing things in a corporate way was very, very common. And so within the various callings, there probably were more or less standard wages which would be set by the borough council. And you weren't allowed it, as we heard about the bakers earlier. There were limits on the number of staff you could employ. So actual competition was pretty strictly regulated, and you could easily see why people were dissatisfied with the services that they got, and why petitions were regularly lodged with the Scottish Parliament to do something about it.
Interesting. Yeah. Anybody else? Don't be shy. Thank you.
There was a reference to poor souls being nailed by their ears for begging. Then, what was the general employment? Was it agricultural or was it?
Well, Glasgow was still a semi-agricultural town right up until the 18th century. Not maybe quite to the extent that it would have been the case in places like Italy and Spain, where people had to hide from the pirates. And you did get pirates in this country as well, and in Ireland people came from Barbary in North Africa to take away whole villages and sell them in slave markets in North Africa. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the point of your question.
If people were being nailed because
Oh
of
yes,
begging,
yes. What happened?
surely poverty must have been rife.
Poverty was rife up until up until the beggar's summons of I think that was January 1560. The various religious houses in Scotland did give an element of what we would call social care. That was certainly the case with regard to the Dominican convent in Glasgow, which Queen Mary gave to the university, and the Greyfriars convent of Franciscans. And when the Franciscan friary site was excavated in the latter part of the last century, a number of skeletons were found, some of whom were women, which showed that the help given by the Greyfriars at least extended to people who were not part of the order and who had sought help in the friary. But after the Reformation, just as in England, there were a lot of people who were without sustenance, who prior to that might have been helped, and that was why the Elizabethan Parliament passed the Vagabonds Act, and why we followed 20 years later.
Fascinating. Well, time for one more comment, question. Thank you.
Did you mention militia or soldiers? Or
Yes, I did, or at least in passing. Now, one of the duties of the Burgesses was to defend the king and to defend the town, and these were organised into various companies. In towns that were big enough, the various guilds might have their own troops. In Glasgow, this subsisted right up until the 19th century, where the Trades Regiment of Volunteers was recruited to fight Napoleon. But there were also organisations like this in earlier times, and for instance, at the time of the 1745 Rising, it was recognised in Glasgow that we didn't have sufficient forces here to withstand Prince Charles Edward Stuart on his way south. And if it hadn't been for Cameron of Lochiel on the way back, we'd probably have been sacked. And on each occasion, we had to deliver a quantity of clothing and shoes to the Prince's army. And in gratitude for that, it is still apparently the case that if Cameron of Lochiel gives notice he's coming to Glasgow, there's supposed to be a carillon played on the bells in the Tron steeple. But I've never heard it myself.
Well, excellent way to complete. And I ask Andrew to give a vote of thanks.
Well, the American writer and patron of the arts, Gertrude Stein, once said, "Silent gratitude isn't much use to anyone." And it seems to me that's a pretty good explanation of why we have a vote of thanks after a lecture of this kind. So it's my privilege as one of the most recently appointed trustees to be in the position to thank Gordon tonight on your behalf. I have heard Gordon's short talks before in the form of his dialogues with the Reverend Mark Johnston going round the cathedral explaining the signs and symbols of the stained glass windows. But this is the first time I've heard him give a full-length lecture. Now, Gordon is steeped in the history of Glasgow, but he's also a lawyer, and there are certain skills and qualities that we associate with that profession, like thorough knowledge of the subject, a grasp of detail, and an ability to talk persuasively. So it's not surprising we saw these qualities in tonight's lecture. I'm sure we were all impressed by a number of things. The first thing that impressed me was this enormous range of reference. I was scribbling down some things while he was talking, with references to the Davidian revolution of King David, with references to mosaics of Ravenna, Pat McIntosh novels, this point that captures some of your attention about nailing the vagabonds by the ear. I think we'll all remember that one. Disputes over herring, the fact that an ox or a pig was worth 5 sheep, and of course a reference to Billy Connolly. So pretty wide range of reference there. It was very impressive. The next thing that struck me as a theme running through all the detail that he gave us was how throughout history that the secular and the religious were intertwined. The Jocelyn overseeing the reconstruction of the cathedral, but also being behind the Glasgow Fair, where apparently you could buy these gloves made in Paris. I was also very astonished really to hear that how detailed and sophisticated a system of local control there was at that time. I mean, I think sometimes nowadays we think, don't we, that there are more and more little rules that we have to follow and regulations come in. But compared to what Gordon was telling us about, there were far more. I think in the past, even down to that bit about the bakers' ovens and exactly how much each worker in the bakery was to be paid. I remember once talking to Gordon on the phone, and he was explaining something to me, and I replied, "Well, I never knew that." To which Gordon responded, "Well, as Stanley Baxter would say, you ken new." And I did think of that quite often during his talk, when he told us all these fascinating little snippets of information, like so much changes over the centuries, and yet place names remain constant, or all these details about just the fact that It's because so many buildings were made of thatch and woodwork that's why you got the fires all the time, and even the first Bishop's Castle would have been made of timber too. So, a fascinating talk, and as I said at the beginning, silent gratitude isn't much use, so let's thank Gordon in the traditional.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, Stephen. First off, I know that the one thing you're not supposed to do when you stand up to speak, incidentally, I'm Neil Baxter, is apologise. So, my apologies to Gordon for trying to put his lights out at the beginning of that address, and my apologies to Vincent because I requested that Vincent put his lights out, and I have to say I have not been quite so firmly put down since Mrs. Crawford in Primary 3, and that was in 1968, so I am suitably chastised. We've had a feast for the intellect. We are now due to a feast for the senses and the intellect. Vincent Mellon has written 2 extraordinary and special songs which celebrate St Mungo and his extraordinary, if he actually existed, his extraordinary contribution to this city, which primarily was making it and inventing it, which is probably, quite a good thing to have done. I think most people would agree to that. So I'm not going to give you any further ado. Thank you, Stephen, for your kind introduction today. Thank you, Catherine, for founding the St Mungo Festival and indeed the Medieval Trust, to which a number of those present contribute and from which all of those present benefit. And can I introduce Vincent Mellon to sing 2 songs on the theme of St Mungo. Thank you very much.
I was asked by Joe Loken in 2011 to write a song about St Mungo. I came here and I was writing down notes. And I said, when do you need it? He said, well, the 13th. I said, the 13th of January. This was in the middle of a hot night party. Half 10 at night, and I was like, sober. Aye, no problem. So, sat down the next day, and this, you saw it here, this is the Mellon Diner song. What did you know? What could you see by Mellon Diner side? To travel far with only faith to spread the gospel wide. Down by the Mellon Diner bar, a fire to keep you warm. The past and future visions bring of great things yet to come. What did you know? What could you see by Mellon Diner side? To travel far with only faith to spread the gospel wide. Rejected by your royal kin, Saint Sir, he showed your path. A life of faith did convert bring to deep and lasting faith. What did you know? What could you see by Mellon Diner side? To travel far with only faith to spread the gospel wide. The bird, the bell, the fish, the tree, your life of faith recall. Those centuries have come and gone, your spirit's with us still. What did you know? What could you see by Mellon Diner side? To travel far with only faith to spread the gospel wide. Let from all the world, near Glasgow now called home. What did you know? What could you see? My Valentine side to travel far with only faith to spread the gospel wide. You may be wondering why two different guitars. Well, this one's a steel 12 string, that one's a nylon classical, and because I've got several guitars. Anyway, and this one, Burgesses Fish Tree. That started off as a working title. I thought I'll come round and get something better, but they're good. So it's Burgesses Fish the Tree. And I can't remember, 2017, I actually went on a tour around the whole of Glasgow. I eventually gave up. I just went online to Google Maps and I found over 300 different examples of the coat of arms. Some of them were complete coats of arms, some of them were just the individual parts of it. Therein lies madness. I wonder where they are. I started Glasgow Cross and just, oh my goodness. So a bit of an obsessive about the coat of arms. That inspired me to write this wee one, Burgesses Fish Tree. And each of the verses is the different part of the coat of arms speaking about itself.